This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, Russell, go ahead and start. Oh, we can't hear you.
He'd unmute.
He's not on mute, but we can't hear him.
It doesn't help to get closer to the screen.
Can I yell at
Maybe we get subtitles.
it?
That's it. Sign
There you
language.
go.
Sign language.
I like those sign language people now.
Okay.
The only one I remember on sign
Wait a
language,
minute, we can hear you, so go ahead.
I think is this one.
That's you, Russell?
And that's a bull. And that's the other end of the bull.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
There you
Okay.
go.
Had the wrong selection.
There you
Okay.
go.
Thanks everybody for coming. I don't have to do my sign language, even though on some of those press conferences they get really into it.
To the higher lady.
Yeah. I like watching some of the facial expressions. But anyway, we'll go ahead and get started. We'll have just a little prayer. Thank you everybody for attending tonight. Even though we didn't travel here, we've come over the internet, but hopefully everybody's staying safe during this time. And that's pretty much it. So, amen.
Amen.
Okay, Pledge of Allegiance. The flag's already there.
I pledge allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic
Republic
For
for
which
which
it stands,
one nation
nation, under God, indivisible,
indivisible,
with
with
liberty
liberty
and
and
justice.
justice for all.
for all.
I'm used to standing. So, okay, tonight we have Sal Acosta with us, one of our newer members. I also do want to take a minute before I go on to thank Harvey for attending tonight from the Pittsburgh chapter. I'm pretty sure everybody knows by now that sadly the Pittsburgh chapter has dissolved, and we've gained some new members from Pittsburgh, so that's kind of a good thing for us, and hopefully maybe we'll get some more. But thank you for attending. But like I said, tonight we have Sal Acosta with us, a business broker and managing partner of Landon and Acosta LLC. He's going to talk to us about secrets to buying or selling a business. So I'm going to turn it over to him.
Well, Russell, thank you very much. And like I said before we even got started here, I'm going to keep it to 20 minutes. So I'm going to plow through a lot of the slides as quickly as possible because, for one, I don't want to bore you. For two, I want to leave time for questions and answers. And maybe the third is I'll try to maybe bias it a little bit towards, IT things that we may have to think about as we go through this process. Okay, perfect. Can everybody see my slides?
Yes.
Okay. So first, let me tell you, the thing of buying and selling businesses is actually a real horror story, because there's a lot of businesses out there that never sell. And quite honestly, and you hear me talk about this a couple of times, it's because of lack of preparation and lack of thinking ahead and lack of planning ahead. Because this does take a little bit of time and it does take a little bit of effort. The sad part is, a lot of these businesses end up becoming what we call zombies, which is businesses that don't really disappear. They just kind of muddle along, but they're not really growing. They're not really doing anything. They're becoming stagnant. And then eventually, by the way, they fall prey to a competitor. They go bankrupt. The owner passes away, and it's a fire drill, and the assets get sold for whatever they can get for the assets, as opposed to like a real business. So that's a shame of all this, and hopefully this type of seminar will create the awareness that you have to plan a little bit ahead to make an orderly transition, and quite honestly, to save a lot of wealth that these owners have developed their business for 10, 20, 30 years. A significant portion of their wealth and their retirement fund, and the wealth of family members and kids and whatever I tie up in this business. You want to make sure you can get that back out. But the good news is, again, through seminars like this, this is something that we can fix. So today, and by the way, feel free to interrupt at any time. Because, like I said, I think this will be a lot more fun if there's questions and answers, either through the presentation or at the end. But today, real quick, just going to talk a little bit about Landon and Acosta, which is my firm. The benefits of buying an existing business. What does the seller want? What does the buyer want? The benefits of using a business broker, and then kind of the main steps in the buy-sell process. And that's where I plan to spend the bulk of the time of the 18 to 20 minutes. Okay, makes sense up to there? Okay. So first of all, real quick, I was born in Cuba. I actually speak Spanish. I got my engineering degree back in 80 to 84. Believe it or not, we didn't have laptops back then. I was able to become an engineer because we did have calculators. Slide rules are already passed, but we didn't have laptops. So there's a lot of graph paper that we were using back then. I did my MBA at Tulane University, and I was lucky that I always have sort of a dual career focus. On the one hand, I work for high-level companies, multinationals, global corporations, and on the other hand, I always had a sort of an entrepreneurial streak. These are actually pictures of actual businesses that I own. I had vending machines. I had a mobile oil change business. That's not me, by the way, although I think by now I do look like that guy. And then from a corporate executive position, these are some of the companies that I work for. And these are some of the actual products that we were manufacturing when I worked there. So if you look at the top right, that's Motorola. That's a pager. Because again, we were making pagers, and that was like the coolest thing in the world before there were cell phones, okay? But just to kind of put it in a little bit of a historical context there. Did teach accounting at Belmont College in personal finance. Dolfo liked this. Flew with the Civil Air Patrol as a second lieutenant. Used to do a lot of charity bike rides. That was 100 pounds ago. Volunteered at the Belmont County Animal Shelter. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the types of clients that we can help. Okay. Questions up to there before I talk about the types of clients that we can help. Okay.
Hey, Sal, and I did have to take a second to unmute. I think, it's really interesting, and I think one of the great parallels between your background and mine is the fact that we've done both the entrepreneurial thing as well as working for Megaco or Megacorp. Interesting point when you can end up looking back at the vast majority of your career. Which of the two did you prefer?
That is a very good question. Let me answer this way, because I think this is the most honest answer. There was a point in my life where I had to make a choice. I had to either continue with my entrepreneurial businesses, which I enjoyed like heck, and were producing, a very reasonable amount of money and cash flow, or I had to basically shut them down because I had to relocate, and these businesses were not easily movable to take on a higher level corporate role. Okay, which of course was also very well paid, and all the perks, all the benefits, all the everything. So I actually had to make that decision at one point in my life, and I decided to go with a corporate role. So based on that, I'd have to say that I preferred the corporate role. That a fair answer?
And I think that is a completely fair answer. It's kind of funny. You see a lot of people from corporate America end up trying the entrepreneurial role, and they either love it or they immediately find a way out of it and head back to corporate America. And I guess I kind of, I did the corporate thing when I'll never forget the first year that we were on our own. And my wife looked at me and she said, "You made 1/10 this year of what you made last year working for Mexico." And I guess I always found that to be an interesting thing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I
But
agree. You know what? Maybe I'll just say it like this. And I think this is a fair statement too. I mean, it's like cats and dogs. There's nothing bad, more or less, with cats. There's nothing bad with dogs. There's people that like dogs. There's people that like cats. It's not like one's better than the other. But it is a completely different animal.
But you seem to be drawn back to entrepreneurialism.
Yes, yes. As a matter of fact, yes, I am back to running my own company, helping other entrepreneurs, and to maybe add a little bit of personal color around that. I think it came down to three things. One is because of my long career in manufacturing, if I wanted to continue in those high level manufacturing roles, I was going to have to leave the US and go overseas. And quite frankly, even though I had taken tons of business trips, and some of these business trips were literally like months long, I didn't want to live outside the United States permanently. Two, because of certain transactions that I had done in the corporate world related to buying and selling businesses, I got bonuses that finally made me at least financial secure. Let me say it that way. So I didn't have to say, okay, if I go on my own, I got to find a way to sell something to somebody. Otherwise, I can't pay the house or something like that. And three, quite honestly, I figured I had maybe two more good transitions in me. So all those things aligned, and I said, okay, fine. I'm going to do one more entrepreneurial thing after this, and maybe there'll be one more after this, and that'll be that. Is that reasonable? Any more questions?
no, it makes perfect sense.
Okay. All right. Well, then let me go back to this for a second.
I just don't think entrepreneurs ever give up. You don't have one more thing. You don't have a lot of things.
I'll tell you, Don, one of the interesting things for me, I mean, I kind of took my last check from somebody else on June 13th of 1988. And then for 18 months after I sold my business, I ended up working for Gannett. And the problem is, besides running my business, they wanted me to do things that I considered boring. And I think that was the biggest thing. And most of it was not about growing businesses. It was about managing a balance sheet. So when they wanted me to quote harvest a business, I really had problems. I had an ethical dilemma with that, which is why I immediately, I had an 18-month contract. I was there for 18 months and one day.
Let me say this, by the way. We're getting a little bit of feedback. So if everybody could kind of mute themselves until they want to just interrupt and ask a question, I think this would help the sound a little bit. But again, please feel free to interrupt with any questions you have as we go along here. And again, I'll try to keep this as short as possible. So just talking a little bit about what we can do. You can see the types of businesses that we can help, revenues in the 1 to 20 million, employees 10 to 250, cash flow 250,000 to $2 million. This is kind of the range that we can work on typically, which is basically a 2-hour radius around Wheeling, West Virginia. But if the deal's sufficiently big, if they're willing to work for, pay for travel, if we're going to market the opportunity nationally, then obviously we can go outside this radius. But this is more for the smaller type businesses that you're going to market locally, and that the buyer is going to be somewhere local. We're industry agnostic. We'll basically help anybody that wants to be helped by us. I'm going to skip the benefits of owning your own business and what the buyer wants, just because I think that I'll share these slides and that should be sort of obvious. And these are the things that the buyer is looking for. I'm going to talk a little bit about, real quick, before we go to the actual process, of the benefits of using a broker, because some of these may not be obvious. But basically, one is, of course, the expertise and the experience, right? A lot of these transactions are private, so it's hard to find information out there on the internet. It's hard to figure out sort of what is reasonable to ask for, what is not reasonable to ask for, what is customary, what is crazy. So just because a broker like me is consistently involved in trying to do these transactions, obviously the business owner at the end can agree to whatever he wants, but at least we can say, hey, listen, this is a reasonable request, or this is crazy, or this is crazy, but maybe this is the way we can accommodate the buyer. The other thing we bring to the table, of course, is our network. We know a lot of bankers, lawyers, accountants, realtors, etc. Because again, not every lawyer does this type of work. Not every banker does this type of work. Not every CPA does this type of work. So it's good to know these professionals that are in their fields, but also are knowledgeable about these types of transactions. And finally, and the most important one, and that's why I put it there in red, is we can help to keep these transactions private and confidential. And that is very, very important. And the reason is, if people know that you're putting your business up for sale, typically nothing good can come of it. Okay. Your customers could get nervous and they could seek a new service provider because they don't know what's going to happen with your business, if you're even going to be in business. Maybe they're scared that if you can't sell it, you'll close it. So they figure, okay, we might as well secure our supply chain in our own terms and in our own time frame. Same thing with the employees. They may say, oh my God, the new owner may bring in his crew or just fire me because he doesn't like me, or ask for concessions, or whatever the case may be. The best time to find a job is when you have a job. So employees may again decide to kind of leave on their own time frame and their own terms before they lose control of the situation. And same thing for suppliers. They may eliminate the credit or some incentives, or something with that relationship could change. So again, typically nothing good can come of letting the general public know, and your competitors, and again, customers, employees, that your business is for sale. So that's why, as we engage with potential buyers, we have them sign a thing called the NDA, which is a non-disclosure agreement, which basically binds them not to tell other third parties that that your business is for sale. And then, of course, also, by the way, we as brokers, we pre-qualify the potential buyers to make sure that they're a good strategic fit, to make sure they have the financial wherewithal to do the transaction if they so choose to at the end. Because obviously the situation you want to avoid is that a buyer completely falls in love with the business, but if he doesn't have the money to do the transaction, or can't get the loan or the investors or whatever the case may be, then the transaction is not going to happen, and you just wasted a lot of time and effort and gave a lot of information to this buyer that really can't execute the transaction. So does that make sense up to there? Questions or comments up to there? Okay. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the main steps for selling a business. And by the way, these are the main steps as I see it. Okay, there's no like official sequence. Different people can do it different ways. Some of these steps are optional. But this is what I have found that works pretty well and is pretty reasonable. So basically, the first thing you want to do, and I'll go into all of these in detail, you want to prepare, you want to value the business, you want to improve the valuation, you want to establish who the process driver is and the key players, you want to identify, find, and qualify potential buyers, you want to do a negotiation, come to an agreement, and then you want to do a letter of intent, you want to go into a due diligence process, and you want to go into a closing. Okay? And I'm going to go into the detail of all of these now, but before I go into that detail, does that make sense up to there?
Yes, I have a question for later on with respect to the effort and what you're doing to develop new processes or new instruments in the changing fiscal and HR scenario coming up after the virus. Not now, but I just wanted to get it in there.
Okay, fair enough. All right. So the very first step is to prepare. Okay. And basically, preparing is getting all your ducks in a row, getting all your paperwork together. Okay. Now, from an IT perspective, by the way, going back to that for a second, one of the ways you can help with the preparation step is to establish a repository for all this documentation. Because let me tell you, even for a small business, it's amazing how much documentation you have to deal with. Okay, so on the very low end, the most sort of basic of the basic, some businesses will just set up a Dropbox or something like that to start putting their files in there, so it's easy to share with a potential buyer. And then if you're more sophisticated than that, you can create what's called the data room, which has different capabilities. But basically, you can slice and dice things, give access to different people, to different files, different subdirectories, things like that. So however sophisticated or unsophisticated you do it, recognize that this preparation step is a big paper chase, and you need to think about a way to keep all these documents sort of collected and organized in a sort of single central repository. And the other way to think about this too, by the way, is a lot of people think about it as a reverse due diligence, and I'll talk about due diligence further on down the road. But basically, there's checklists of documents that potential buyers are going to want to look at. Okay, things like the obvious, financial statements, tax returns, leases, payroll, list of assets, inventory, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So go through those checklists, collect those documents, organize them, and put them in a central place. And by the way, you may find, which is why this step is the first step and is so important, you may find that you have gaps in your documents. So for example, you may find that your employees have not signed non-compete agreements because maybe you didn't even think about it at the time when you started the business because you weren't planning to sell. But now it's important for your employees to have non-compete agreements. So now you need to identify those gaps of either documents or processes or things that are important to a potential buyer and close those gaps while you have time, because what you don't want to do is engage with a potential buyer and then delay the process while you clean up these gaps, because again, nothing good can come of that, right? Just like you may be engaging with multiple potential buyers may be looking at multiple companies to buy. And if you don't have your ducks in a row and you delay, they may simply go buy something else and then that's it, and they're done and they're out of the market, and you lost the opportunity. So it's very important that as much as possible, you have all your documents ready to go and all your processes clean and everything, so that again, you don't slow down or delay the process once you find a buyer that's interested. So does that make sense up to there? Okay. This is a very common question, and that's why I have this slide out here. Usually the question comes up, okay, how long does it take to sell a business? And quite honestly, people are surprised about how long it takes. So on the bottom axis, you can see basically the transaction value, okay? And you can see that as the transaction value gets higher, it takes longer to close these deals, okay? And you can see that basically we're looking at, this is in months. So we're looking at 11 months, which is basically a year. At the low end for the smaller deals, 6 months. So I always tell people, and this is from listing to close. So this is from the minute you sign my paperwork, you hire me to try to help you sell your business, to when you actually close and hopefully get in check in hand as part of that close. You should be planning for 6 months to a year. One thing that's kind of interesting is if you see it actually starts to drop off a little bit as you get into the much bigger transactions of $5 to $50 million. And that's, I think, because when you're dealing with these bigger transactions, then all the parties are more used to doing this type of transaction, are more sophisticated, know what they need to do, and again, what's reasonable, what the process is, so they can move through the steps faster than the smaller transactions where the buyer, the seller, and quite frankly, sometimes even their attorneys and their CPAs are not used to doing this on a day-to-day basis. So does that make sense up to there? Okay. The other thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to value the business. So again, so you know what your business is worth, and you know what a reasonable asking price is, because like anything else that you're selling, you don't want to set an asking price that is so incredibly high that you discourage buyers from even engaging with you, trying to figure out what the opportunity is, decide if there's a good fit, et cetera, et cetera. So you want to value the business so that you don't go crazy on the high side. And the flip side is, of course, you don't want to, put it out in the market for too low, because if you close, you're going to leave money on the table as a seller. So you want to get a feel for what the business could be worth before you even start. And then, by the way, and you can see it here again, the x-axis is sort of the transaction value, and the y-axis is the multiple paid on SDE. And SDE stands for seller's discretionary earnings. And we could be talking for a long time on that topic, but let me just maybe distinguish it a little bit from net profit or cash flow or things like that. Seller's discretionary earnings, you can think about it as basically the cash flow that the new owner is going to put in his pocket when the business is run correctly and most efficiently and most productively. Okay. So if owners sometimes try to run every possible expense they can think of through the business, quite honestly, to lower taxes. So all those things need to be adjusted to figure out, again, when the business is run correctly and productively and efficiently and profitable in the future, how much money the new buyer is going to put in his pocket. And then you apply these multipliers and you get at least a rough indication of what the value of that business could be. But notice, by the way, and this surprises a lot of people, these numbers are actually very low. I mean, we're talking in the neighborhood of 2 to 4.5. Okay, so if you think of a business that has the potential to put, $100,000 in the pocket of the new owner, that business may get sold for as low as $200,000. Okay. And again, if on the high end you're looking at a multiple of 4.5 to maybe 5. So again, a lot of people are surprised by how low these multiples are. Okay, and by the way, a lot of times a seller will tell me, well, if I can only get 2.5 or 3.5 times the money I'm putting in my pocket, I'll just continue to run my business for another 2 or 3.5 years. And that's fine, as long as you're willing to take all the risks associated with that. And that could be a whole other conversation. But, there's the risk of the market changing, incapacitation. I mean, all kinds of things. Questions and comments up to there?
Sal, I mean, there's so many different valuation schemes right now that I've ended up hearing, X number of times EBITDA is one that I hear all the time. Free cash flow valuations, SDE kind of makes sense to me, especially for smaller, for the sub $2 million businesses. Did that come out of a particular industry? Because I've never, and I guess I've almost always dealt with, .coms, which are funky valuations, but manufacturing companies tend to end up looking at, I guess, more of a cash flow model. I mean, does that change somewhat too?
Well, so you bring up an excellent question, and I'll answer this way. Valuation is kind of like beauty. It's in the eye of the beholder. Okay. And just like you said, there's 10,000 different ways to value a business. And some of them are industry dependent. Some of them are size dependent. I can tell you this particular data, just so you know where it comes from, is a survey that Pepperdine University does, that they pull the different business brokers and crunch the data together and then spit out a report that's about 100 pages. And I've just picked out 2 pages out of the 100 pages. But here's the other kind of way that I personally see it. As opposed to maybe a .com or a Facebook or something else, these are small Main Street businesses, and their primary purpose, at least in my mind and in my book, is to put cash in the new owner's pocket. And if we agree that the purpose of the business is to put cash in the owner's pocket, the new owner's pocket, then the way I'm going to value it is the most direct way I can value it, which is I'm going to figure out how much cash it can put in the new owner's pocket and apply a multiple to that. As opposed to using anything else that is, let's say, a proxy for that ability and that capability of the business. So does that make sense?
I think so. I mean, the other thing I can end up understanding is, from a buyer's standpoint, I'm going to spend X dollars on this business. And I think that, people end up looking at a combination of wanting a return on what they've scrimped to save. And at the same time, they want to end up making a decent income. And I think that, SDE ends up being, I think, an excellent way to end up measuring that, articulating that. How's that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And by the way, you hit on a good point, and let me just maybe expand on that a little bit. Sort of a sanity check on a business valuation is, as the buyer, you have to say, okay, this business has to provide for, let's say, a minimum of 3 things. One is a reasonable salary for me, because a lot of times I'm buying a job. This will be my full-time job, 40 hours a week. So I want to be appropriately compensated for my skills, and the business has to allow for me to be properly compensated for my time and effort. The second thing is there has to be enough cash flow there to pay back the loan, because a lot of times this will be a loan through the bank, maybe an SBA guaranteed loan, whatever. So you want to make sure that you can pay back that loan. And third is a little bit of a margin of safety on both of those things, right? Because obviously businesses go up and down, there's ebbs and flows, and there's no guarantees, but you want to have a reasonable margin of safety that you can continue to pay back the loan, and that you can continue to pay yourself a salary that you can live on. Now, having said all that, by the way, I always tell people, don't lose perspective of the fact that this loan is for a certain period of time, 3, 5, 7, 10 years. So you may have to make a personal sacrifice to have a little bit of a lower income, a little bit of a lower lifestyle. But when this loan is paid off to the bank, then you have two choices. You can either take the money you were paying to the bank and put it in your pocket, and that might be a really nice salary, or you can call me again, sell the business, cash out, and put a big check in your pocket. So that's the other perspective that people shouldn't lose. But that, again, is sort of a backdoor sort of sanity check into the valuation, that the cash flow needs to allow for those things. If the valuation is way out of whack, what you'll find is there's not enough cash flow to pay for the loan and to pay you for your time and effort. And I hope that makes sense.
Makes perfect sense. Well, I think it tends to be more real world, and in a lot of cases, the real world portion is possibly the most important.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and not to belabor this point, but maybe I'll say this and we'll move on. A lot of times, the current owner gets himself into a trap where he has these very expensive assets that are true. They're there. I mean, it could be a building, it could be a machine, it could be inventory, it could be whatever the case it is, but it's not generating enough cash flow to justify the investment that would have to be made in buying that business with all those assets. So they'll come to me and they'll say, hey, listen, I want $10 million for this business because I have this asset and that asset and this real estate and this land and this inventory and this equipment. They have a list of all these assets that add up to $10 million. And that's fine. I'm not disagreeing. They're there. But then they tell me, oh, and by the way, my business generates $50,000 in cash flow. And you say, okay, fine. It's hard to justify to a buyer, hey, listen, you're going to invest $10 million to put $50,000 in your pocket. I mean, that just doesn't make sense, right? Or at least for me, I'm of the school of cash flow is king. Let me just even say it that way. At least for me, that doesn't make sense.
Right. Okay.
Fair?
More than fair. And having done most of the M&A stuff that I ended up doing on the corporate side, it was really remarkable to me because recently I ended up with a younger friend in Shadyside. Very successful as a mechanic, had worked for, all the major dealerships in the area and was doing stuff on his own and hit mid-30s and doing it on the floor in his garage was not getting it. I mean, he was making a very good living, but it wasn't getting it. So he went to buy a building, and it just so happened that the guy who had been 40 years in that 3-bay location wanted out of it, so had done no prior planning and wanted out of it so badly that he sold the business with assets for the valuation of the building. And I don't know if he saved well or had an inheritance or what, because the numbers were not, I guess, he was able to end up doing enough, but all of a sudden I've got this here's this young friend, his view of the whole transaction was completely different than mine. Because I was looking at, hey, you're going to end up you're going to go to the bank and you're going to buy this money to end up buying that facility. And how are you going to end up, what's your return going to be? And his concern was, hey, I only have to do 5 oil changes in order to pay for the building. And it completely reset how I ended up looking at the whole thing.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, there's all types of situations. I mean, I remember there was a divorce situation where there was a restaurant involved, and the wife wanted to buy it from the husband, and she was basically offering the value of the real estate appraisal where the restaurant was, and the husband was asking me, well, okay, is this a fair deal? And I said, well, I don't know. I mean, again, to what we were just talking about, I said you have to look at the cash flow of the business, and see how that valuation compares to sort of a real estate valuation of a real estate appraisal of the building. But typically, when you do a cash flow valuation and you take into account that there's customers there, that there's employees there, that there's a menu, that there's recipes, this, that, and the other thing, that is all generating cash flow, I mean, usually that valuation ends up higher than the real estate appraisal of the building as a standalone piece of real estate. But you got to do that homework and you got to do that exercise. So, all right, makes sense?
Makes sense.
All right, moving right along then. There's always a step, I put it in here, it's called improving valuation, because a lot of times when the seller wants to sell, he realizes that the business is not as valuable as he thought. So he has to go through a process of improving the valuation before he can put it on the market. And again, that could be a whole other ball of wax, a whole other conversation. But I put it on here because I see it all the time. They say, oh my God, well, based on what I'm going to get from my business, I can't really retire in the lifestyle in the way that I wanted to retire. And then I said, okay, fine. Then we have to go through a process of improving the valuation so that you can get for the business what you want to get so that you can retire in the way you want to retire. You need to figure out who is going to be the process driver and who are the key players, right? Obviously, in my case, I say the process driver should be the business broker. And my strong recommendation is that the business owner should not be the process driver, because his head should be in running the business, and he shouldn't be sidetracked, because this takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And you can't let the business slip. You can't let the financial for the business slip, because if you allow for any hiccups or any slips, potential buyers are going to use that to hammer you mercilessly on valuation. So now more than ever, the owner needs to focus on running the business, and the business broker then needs to take on the burden of running the process for them. Again, the business broker or whoever it is will identify potential buyers and qualify them. We're not going to talk about that. You will go into a process of negotiation and agreement. And again, there's whole books on this. We could be here all day talking about this. This is a very open-ended process. The only thing that I will say is this is where, again, an experienced business broker can provide value, because they can tell you, the parties are allowed to basically agree to whatever they want to agree, as long as it's not illegal. But the business broker can say, hey, listen, this is what's typically done. This is what's reasonable. Or, hey, you can agree to this, but you're agreeing to something crazy. Okay. Usually you do a letter of intent, which again has a lot of binding and non-binding terms. But the idea is, I think about it as a sort of a dry run or a dress rehearsal for closing. You agree on price, you agree on the assets that are going to be transferred, you agree on, maybe non-competes. I mean, the more stuff you can agree to and put in the letter of intent step, then the less probability there is that the deal will get derailed at the 11th hour. At least that is my philosophy. So, again, you do the letter of intent kind of as a dress rehearsal, as a dry run. And then you go into a process called due diligence, which is basically the buyer will bring in his accountants, his CPAs, his lawyers, whatever, and they will go over everything with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that everything you've told him checks out. And then if everything checks out, and again, these letters of intent are usually non-binding, so even if everything checks out, in theory, people can back out or whatever, but hopefully that's not the case. you do the closing, and then that's it, and there may be some money that is transferred at the time of closing. Some money may be transferred later. There may be, things called earnouts, which is, uh, the seller may continue to give or the buyer, I'm sorry, the buyer, new owner will continue to give the seller, the old owner, some money after the close if the business continues to perform to certain metrics and certain expectations. There may be some holdbacks in case some lawsuits or some unexpected things pop up after closing. But in general, most of the money transfers at that point, and there's a change of ownership. And I guess the last thing I will say is, I've written a book. You can buy it on Amazon, and it'll give you basically everything we've talked about in a lot more detail. And so that's pretty much it. I'll open it up to questions or comments or anything.
I do need to leave now, so thank you, and I'll hopefully catch you next month.
Thank you for your attention, and thank you for your time. Any other questions, comments?
I have one. With the environment is changing greatly, socially, tax-wise, caps on number of employees, etc. Are you developing new models or new algorithms to handle, say, the differences in the cash, the interest rates, employee costs, HR process, etc.? It just looks like it's getting more convoluted.
Well, so let me see if I can answer your question this way. There is another way that I like to think about businesses and that I like to value businesses, because it brings out, and it's still sort of cash based, but it brings out different topics and different things that applying a multiple to large discretionary earnings does not bring out. And basically it is to kind of go forward and create a forecast of the cash flow, and then apply discount rates to those future cash flows to bring it into the present. That's called DCF. It's called discounted cash flow method. And I like it for a couple of reasons. One is, a multiple on seller's discretionary earnings by definition is backward looking. This by definition is forward looking. So to your point, if you expect the environment in the future to change from what was the environment in the past, you can capture that in your forecast as you look forward. Whether it's the employees are going to cost more, the tax rates are going to be different, sales are going to be up, sales are going to be down, you can capture all that. And then it kind of triggers all those conversations, which in my mind at the end need to end up having some impact on cash that you're going to discount, and you're going to come up with a value. So at least from my perspective, I hope that answers your question, and I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, my question was more about you and your organization. Are you looking to add in new processes or new developed and new models of looking at things?
No, not really.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions or comments?
Sal, I think one of the interesting things right now, at least that I'm going through, especially with, for those of you who don't know, I mean, after I sold my business, I ended up making my portfolio look like a barbell. I was real heavy on high risk and I was real heavy on no risk. And what I had was not a whole lot in between. I've moved things back. I'm very happy in the real estate business. My wife does a fabulous job and brings a very healthy percentage to the bottom line. But all of a sudden, I'm kind of getting to that point where I'm looking at cashing in my chips and snowbirding and doing all that other stuff that goes with it. And what happens is the whole tax impact and the tax implications end up becoming such a huge thing, and what we've ended up seeing is a swing, so do I end up trying to take it early on with from do I end up trying to get the cash um, at the lower tax rates that exist now? But if I do that and I'm sitting on cash for retirement, what happens if they end up deciding to do all the means testing that goes with it down in the future? I mean, all of a sudden it ends up becoming almost as risky as going into business all over again. And I mean, the other side of the thing is, we've spent now about 10 years building the real estate business to a point where it runs on its own. And it's almost become well, why don't we just keep on running it? And I guess I find that as being kind of, I mean, the thing with rental business is it's pretty much, there's a fairly standard formula for valuation on it. And it's pretty much cash flow based. But, it's almost like just keep on refining it so that, we end up with a minimal crew that's easy to take care of. Right now, there's payroll services that are online that we can work with, and maybe we just run it for another decade. I mean, I guess I'm at a point where I don't know what the solution is. And I'm finding it interesting because what I don't want to be is, I don't want to get to my early 70s, a decade from now, and then decide, oh boy, now here we go. I know that if I want to sell it in 2 years, that I need to start right now with the prep. And I got that.
And you bring up a lot of interesting points. I'm going to just maybe comment on two. One is there's a lot of money that has been put out through the PPP program, and a lot of people have been taking advantage of that. A lot of people that are smarter than me are telling me basically, hey, listen, there's no free lunch. Eventually, the tax rates are going to go up to bring back into the government all the money they gave out for the PPP. So I don't know. Take it for what it's worth. My crystal ball is not that good, but it does make sense to me that they've been pumping money like crazy into the economy, and it does make sense that at some point over the next couple of years they're going to want to recoup it. Maybe the only other point that I would make is, because I've seen it, a lot of business owners as they get older and they want to maybe take it easier on their responsibilities with the business will start to figure out people, methods, and systems so that the business starts to run more independently. But my experience has been, as no matter how much you do that, the minute you become incapacitated, even if you're only working on the business 10 hours a week, 5 hours a week, the minute you become incapacitated, I don't want to be cynical, the employees will go to town and destroy the business in 6 months. Because they know that those checks and balances are not there. They know those audits are not there. They and so that would be my only caution is, no matter how much you want to put it on autopilot, the minute the pilot's not in the cockpit, things will break loose.
Okay, got it.
Well, guys, any more questions? I mean, we're bumping up here into a couple minutes after 7.
Just one comment, Sal. Where the hell were you 40 years ago when I had a business in Wheeling? Where the hell were you then when I needed you? Where were you at that point? I
don't know. Probably working for Motorola.
I could be in the Bahamas somewhere now. You've been around at that point in time. Thanks a lot. So anyway.
No, you know what? And by the way, seriously, one thing I enjoy, because let me say this, maybe in closing, okay? I am a big believer that in business, there's no right or wrong answers. Everything is shades of gray. and everything is what things do you particularly value, and so what risk can you tolerate, and basically what things are you scared of that you want to avoid, and what risks do you not want to take. But one thing that I enjoy is when I meet a business owner that says, "Hey, Sal, I sold my business 5 years ago, or I sold my business 3 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever the case may be." I always love to ask them the question. I say, "Well, how did you decide what it was worth?" Because it goes back to all these things that we've been talking about. And quite frankly, sometimes you get good answers, and sometimes you get some answers that are not that good.
True, true.
Well, it appears from what you've said and everything is how you value the business. Once you complete the deal, the profit to be made is on how you divide and multiply the cash flows. If Dolph sells something, you got it. You perhaps with the new influences that you may want instead of just a lump sum, but divided cash flows in different ways and in different under different tax laws, say in Canada or whatever. It just it's a it's more planning. That's all. Is all I'm saying.
Yeah,
Well,
but
let me say this too, by the way, and now we're going to get a little bit into the weeds, but since you kind of set it up a little bit, I will make this maybe last comment. Usually we group buyers into two categories. There's financial buyers and there's strategic buyers. Okay. And financial buyers are typically buyers that just want to buy that business. I'll even go as far as saying as a black box. It's just a thing that produces cash flow, that they find an attractive return on investment, that they're going to say, "Hey, I'm going to pay this much out. I'm going to buy this business. I'm going to buy this black box, and it's going to give me this return on investment and this cash," and they'll value it that way. And there's nothing wrong with that. But then you have the strategic buyers that say, "Hey, I am in this business already. I can buy this other business, and there's some synergies that I can exploit. I can maybe leverage my supply chain. I can leverage my sales force. I can leverage my internet presence, whatever the case may be." They identify some synergies, which is the famous 1 + 1 is more than 2. And because of that, typically the strategic buyers end up paying more than the financial buyers. So even there's this sort of marked dichotomy of two groups of people. And of course, that also depends on the strategic buyer being able to identify those synergies, being able to value those synergies in some way, and obviously being able to share those synergies with the seller in some proportion. But if all of that happens, as a seller, you typically get a better deal from the strategic buyer than the financial buyer. You just have to find them and make the case and get them to agree on the synergies and value them and share them. So I hope that makes sense.
Yes, just an anecdote that came to mind was with Elon Musk not being able to manufacture his cars in California. And he's now able to do it. They dropped it after they found out that most of the political power that was keeping the lockdown were all short sellers on his stock. So it makes it complex.
Yeah. Oh, and
I
by the
have
way,
no way to put it.
I'll say this, going back to valuation for a second. I can't tell you how many webinars I've been to over the last 2 weeks on business valuation because, to your point, because of the coronavirus and the lockdown, there is such a dislocation to business as usual that the question that is coming up, okay, what are these businesses worth right now? And so then the question is, okay, Right now they may be closed completely. They may be running at 50% capacity. And there's some cases where it's the opposite. You may have a delivery service or a video conference services where it's actually running better than normal. And then the question is, when things go back to normal, do you keep running at that sort of, abnormally high growth rate, or do you come back down to earth? So there's been a lot of webinars over the last 2 weeks about how do you value in the context of what's happening right now with the coronavirus. And then again, that's a whole other ball of wax and a whole other discussion.
It's
Thank you.
it's really amazing to me too to watch. Some of the institutions that we thought would never end up going anywhere are going to end up with huge changes, and I can't even imagine. I mean, just for example, the restaurant. I mean, I had a pretty good idea of what a valuation on the restaurant was before this thing happened, but I also knew what the gross volume would be, and always, looking at things with a weekly view to profitability. And the last, since the shutdown, we're happy to break even. I never thought I'd say that.
Well, and you know what? And again, not to get too overly complicated and too deep into the weeds, but for something like a restaurant, for example, there might be a little bit of an issue of, can you benefit from being the last man standing? Because if you can break even, or if you can even have a small profit, but a lot of your competing restaurants go out of business because they weren't able to weather the crisis. Then when the crisis is over and there's less restaurants in your community, does that benefit you and increase your valuation?
Well, you want to know the other thing, Sal, and I guess the thing I find most distressing is the shutdown ended up hurting the people who are least able to afford it the most. And in the restaurant example, that, the servers, listen, the servers and the wait staff, they're tipped. That's how they make money. I forget. I don't even know what it is. It's $2 and some an hour is what you end up paying them, and the rest of what they end up making is on tips. And it's no secret a good server makes decent money. All right, a good server at our high-end restaurant makes an awful lot of money, and that's just how it works. And all of a sudden, my daughter was looking at the wait staff, who was used to making north of $15, $16 more than that an hour as wait staff at Pickles. And all of a sudden, if they don't end up making a minimum of the minimum wage, then we need to end up bringing them up, which we did. And we've taken advantage of the money, and all the, the PPP and the other things that end up coming with it come with a whole bunch of strings. It is not free money. It's also remarkable how much discretion the lenders have at this point. Because if you have a friendly lender, they basically have no criteria. They can just decide, we'll give the government's money away. So,
well, and you're right, and it's a lot of it is, what relationship did you have with that lender? Did you have a bank account, a commercial account, whatever the case may be? Quite honestly, some of them are favoring the bigger customers instead of the smaller customers. So there's a lot of gamesmanship going on in that PPP program.
Well, I guess the biggest point is right now we don't know what it's going to look like on the other end. And when I end up looking at the people on here, some of, higher ed. I mean, I'm on the board down at Northern, and I watch what they're going through, and it's absolute insanity right now. Nobody can tell you with any degree of accuracy what things are going to look like in the fall semester. And that's going to end up driving so many things. And right now, the best minds think that 20% of the private institutions are going to shutter.
Well, not only that, and again, not to put a damper on things, but one thing I am personally scared of is, what if there's a second wave or even a third wave? I mean, those are the things that are so hard to figure out, because you could say, okay, fine, I own the restaurant, I open it back up, even if it's at 50, 75% capacity, I can survive and give time for things to get better. But you're kind of trying to gain altitude, and there's a second or third wave that comes along. Maybe the first wave didn't get you, but the second or the third wave will get you.
Well, and I guess from from another standpoint is, I guess there's an old adage that I always learned, which is measure the wrong things, get the wrong answer. And I'm worried that we've been measuring, especially with this whole thing, that we've been measuring the wrong thing and getting the wrong answer. And then, I've got a pretty extensive Rolodex. I know a lot of people. I'm a big mouth. I get it. Okay. But out of the 1,200 people in my Rolodex, and I know that's 1980s term, but in my address book, out of the 1,200 people in my address book, there was exactly one, okay, who ended up being billed as though going into the hospital, being billed as though he had COVID-19. My high school wrestling coach, who was also the athletic trainer. Okay, worked for my dad. He's 85 years old, renal failure, on dialysis. He's diabetic. He's about as round as I am. So he goes in. He's in the hospital for 3 days. He comes back out. Call him on the phone, and his answer was, yeah, my CPAP got dirty. I ended up with an infection. So they took care of it with intravenous IVs. And I'm back home now and I'm better. And they told me I don't have to, that I don't need to self-quarantine or anything. And I guess he had a little bit of a fit on why they ended up putting it down that he had COVID when he didn't test positive. And their answer was, we need the money. And that was the hospital I was hatched in. That was the hospital where I was born, and I could end up seeing it because they 550 beds and they had 5 when they shut down their COVID thing. So I guess I don't know what the right answer is, but what's going to be interesting to watch is people's reaction.
Yeah. Well, Joe and Russell, I mean, I'll be here as long as people want to be here, but I don't want to overstay my welcome. So you guys take over and shut it down or move to a different topic.
I think I agree with Dolph, and I think what you need to do is figure out new ways to do stuff. What that is, I don't know. But, if you look at the Renaissance and going into the from the Dark Ages to the Renaissance, there was a large fight and struggle as the old institutions fought the new to be institutions, the new way of loaning money for people to do a printing press or a ship rather than the old rent out a caravan and go across the Silk Road. And I think it's skill and adeptness to be able to do something differently. When you go into a company, I'm sure that you bring a lot of new ideas and break a lot of molds in your seller's mind. He's already got preconceived expectations, and you have to hold him down and beat up some of those.
Oh,
and I'm suggesting this.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It is amazing, and I know this is a technology group, so maybe you guys are more in tune with all this than the average bear, but it is surprising to me that there are still companies out there that started 30 years ago, and because they're very niche-y and the customers know them and whatever the case may be, a lot of these people don't have websites or have incredibly primitive websites. Or just today I was talking to one that says, hey, listen, we've never done an email blast with constant contact, but we're thinking that we may want to try that. Some of them, this is the very first time they do video conference. They've been forced to do video conference because of the coronavirus. So it is amazing. Some of the companies that, in fairness, by the way, are very successful. I mean, I'm not saying these companies are struggling. They're very successful. But in my mind, and to your point, they could be even more successful if they put some effort into renewing their technology or even creating their technology.
Yes, you give them new tools like a knife and a fork, and you give them a bowl of soup, and they'll still beat the bowl. You can't get the soup out. You know, it's expectation. There's a whole re-education stuff there,
Yeah,
which I think is worthy.
I think the biggest change that we can anticipate is how people are going to react. And I guess, you know, I have a couple of friends' children who are in the Czech Republic, and they opened back up a few weeks back now. And Denmark opened, and I have friends in Denmark who I keep in touch with, and Denmark's been reopened now for 3 weeks. And I guess I'm just trying to end up, you know, in both of those societies tend to be much more color within the lines than we are in the United States. I don't want to put it any other way. And the problem is they went in with all the best intentions for social distancing and masks and everything else, and it lasted about 72 hours. And then they went right back to where they were, and they blew through the rest of it, and their numbers continue to decrease.
I think you just have to learn to be flexible.
Well, yeah, but the problem is now we've got a supply chain that ends up going back behind that, and how is it going to be able to react? And there's going to be, we lived in a land of plenty where anything we wanted we had. We placed the order on Amazon and it just appeared. And for the most part, through all of this, that has continued because they were essential. Now, I guess the question is, what's it going to look like when we fire the sucker back up and everything goes back to where it was? But I don't think there'll be a single institution that'll be unchanged.
I think if it goes back the way it was, it is sort of doomed to failure. I mean, people are resilient to change. That's the nice thing about marriage. They force you to change. I didn't know you had to pick up socks. It's just adapting and, turning over and looking at something new in a different way. That's all. And I don't think it's easy because you've got the old forces that are going to beat you down. I mean, economic processes in Wheeling are somewhat rigid or less flexible than new ones.
It's the old, we've never done it that way. Well, guess what? You may have never done it that way, but you're going to. You're going to do it differently or you're going to perish.
Right. But, I think you've got to keep supporting flexibility and new ways of doing it,
I have a call in to one of the guys who I consider the most successful man I've ever met. And he has managed multiple technology changes, but his distribution channel remains identical. Okay. But his distribution channel was 800 hearing aid dispensers that were his customers. What happens is if you buy a hearing aid, they take an impression of your ear and then they send it off to the lab. Well, he's that lab. And then whoever makes the electronics package sends him the electronics package. He marries the two and sends it back to the dispenser. Well, his whole marketing scheme was he'd go 4 times a year, he'd go on a cruise with 200 of his customers on each one. You can see the picture here, and you can end up you could see the problem. So for the last 8 weeks, his people have been shut down. He's got, a handful of very highly paid and skilled employees. And I mean, he's completely digital. When he started this, it was analog, it was a lump of clay that came in. They had a low loss process for making it. Now the thing comes in, it's 3D scanned. It makes the part, they do the whole thing, but it's completely there. His trick has always been not only the attention to service, but the personal part that goes with it. It's been quite remarkable. Now, what does the future bring? I mean, people are going to end up going back for their hearing aids. I think that's a gimme. The question is, what's he going to cook up now? What does he have to end up coming up with? Because, you don't want to bring your customers out on a cruise.
Well, an existing system, a C5A aircraft, has 17 different material systems in it. I was talking to the person that's in charge of maintenance. He says, these things break down all the time. Do you realize what I have to carry to fix any of these 17 material systems? And then 2 years later, I talked to him. He goes, hey, I got me some 3D printers. He says, I got these tubes of all the different materials. And I just put them in there, trim them down, and it works. He says, worked good enough to get it back home. And, that was, I guess, situations that caused him to change. To tell a guy, hey, you want to put a piece of plastic on that plane.
Yeah. Well, what is it? Necessity is the mother of invention.
Yep.
That's only half a word. I thank you.
Russell, anything else?
I don't have anything. I want to thank Sal for presenting tonight.
Thank you guys for having me.
Thank you, Sal. Great presentation. Thank you.
Yes.
You're real welcome. Thank all of you guys for the questions and the interest.
Thought provoking.
Take care. See you all next time.
One comment. Get a hold of Joe Kralik over there. I found a newspaper insert from 1983 when the DPMA chapter was doing an expo here in Wheeling from 1883. And the star was Joe Kralik. There's all kind of pictures of Joe Kralik. There it is, from 1983. Be interested to see. He hasn't changed one bit. Pissed me off to no end. And he looks exactly the same as he did in 1983. And the rest of us have aged in the process. Just ticked me off to no end, So.
Hey, listen, if they didn't open the barber shops, he'd be right back to that same hairdo.
This was 1983. This was the insert in the Wheeling newspaper that we did the expo. It was a great.
It was well presented. It was a lot of fun. We did it for about 8 years and
27 years. Wow.
So anyway, some good pictures of Joe from 1983 back there. Just.
Thank you.
Just takes me off that he hasn't changed one bit. That just irks me to no end. But that's all right. So. Anyway,
Well,
thank you,
John,
Sal. Great job.
I'm going to go ahead and drop out here. I've got a amateur radio network I want to participate in tonight, but it's been great seeing you all. And Sal, thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank you
Al.
guys for coming and for the questions. And I'm going to shut it down also from my end.
Give us the place where we can see the video.
Yes. I will send you a link on YouTube that you can go see the video. I'll send you guys a copy of the chat log. So whatever you put in the chat log will be there in the chat log. So I will do those two things. It takes the system a couple hours to process the video, but as soon as it's processed, I'll send you the link, and then
That's too much time, and it's not like the old way. I like paper. I can write on it. Put a crossword in there.
Well, listen, for you, I might send you a VHS, or I'll send you a Betamax.
Just something I can play on my 8-track.
There you go.
Hey, and we'll get you some Crayolas to write on it.
They let me use them in the home.
Gentlemen,
See you all. Thank you.
All right, guys. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Joe.